The morning of August 14, 1886, brought no mercy to Timber Creek. By dawn, the temperature had already climbed to 93 degrees, and the sun rose blood-red through a haze of dust that had not settled in weeks. The creek that gave the town its name had shrunk to a muddy trickle, barely deep enough to wet a horse's fetlocks, and the cottonwoods along its banks stood with leaves curled inward, their silver undersides turned to the merciless sky as if in supplication. This was the fourth consecutive month without meaningful rain. The wells had dropped another inch in the past week alone, and in the pastures surrounding the town, cattle had begun to die. They fell where they stood, too weak to seek shade, their bodies bloating in the heat until the ranchers could drag them away. 212 souls called Timber Creek home that August, and every one of them could taste the dust on their tongues when they woke and feel the grit between their teeth when they tried to sleep. The extended drought that would define a generation had entered its killing phase. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1883, a gaunt young man had ridden into Timber Creek leading a Palomino mare whose coat shone like a new penny in the afternoon light. Caleb Beckett was 24 years old, with the kind of face that looked older than its years, weathered already by grief and travel, with eyes that watched more than they spoke. He carried little in the way of possessions: a bedroll, a change of clothes, a rifle of modest quality, and a leather satchel worn soft with age. Inside that satchel, wrapped in oilcloth against the elements, lay 3 journals filled with handwriting so precise and small that each page held 1,000 words. The journals had belonged to his grandmother, Moira Beckett. Moira had survived the Highland clearances as a girl of 12, watching English soldiers burn the only home she had ever known. She had walked to the coast with her mother and 2 sisters, eating roots pulled from frozen ground, drinking snowmelt collected in their palms. Of the 4 who began that journey, only Moira reached the ship bound for America. She never spoke of what happened to the others. What she did speak of, endlessly and with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction, was preparation. Root cellaring, preservation, the reading of signs that nature provided to those patient enough to observe. She taught young Caleb that swallows flying low meant rain within the day, that restless cattle meant storms approaching, and that when the woolly caterpillars grew thick coats in July, drought would follow before harvest. She taught him to seal jars with beeswax in layers, to pack vegetables in salt, to smoke meat until it could last years without spoiling. She taught him that every jar filled was a promise kept to tomorrow, a promise that you had remembered it today. Moira Beckett died in the autumn of 1882, at the age of 71. She passed in her chair beside the fire, her hand still resting on the final jar of the season, her fingers curled around Caleb's own as she guided him through the last motions of sealing the wax. He felt the moment her grip softened, felt the breath leave her body like a whisper, and he sat there for a long time afterward, holding her cooling hands, watching the firelight play across the jar they had sealed together. Tomatoes. She had always said tomatoes were the hardest to preserve and the most rewarding. He buried her beside the cabin where she had raised him, wrapped in the quilt she had brought from Scotland, and he carved her name into a stone he hauled from the creek. Then he packed her journals, sold what could be sold, and rode west with copper until he found a place where no one knew his grief and where the land itself seemed to demand the skills she had given him. Timber Creek sat in a high valley in the Colorado Territory, ringed by mountains that promised water and timber in abundance. Most newcomers looked at the fertile bottomland near the creek, the gentle slopes suitable for farming, the meadows where cattle could graze fat and content. Caleb Beckett looked at the North Hillside. The North Hillside was considered worthless. The soil was thin, the rock underneath was limestone, and the slope received less sun than any other parcel in the valley. The previous owner had tried to farm it twice and failed both times, leaving behind the ruins of a cabin that had never been completed and a reputation for bad luck. When Caleb offered $60 for the entire claim, the land office clerk had laughed and counted out the change as if the young man were buying a joke. Caleb was not buying a joke. He was buying precisely what he needed. Limestone composition meant the rock would be easier to excavate than granite or shale. Northern exposure meant the interior of any underground chamber would remain naturally cool, even in the worst heat of summer. The thin soil was a disadvantage for farming, certainly, but Caleb had not come to Timber Creek to farm. He had come to prepare. The first year he lived in a canvas tent pitched against the ruined cabin wall, working by lantern light through the short winter days and by filtered sunlight through the long summer ones. He spoke to no one but Copper, and she proved an excellent listener. She had been with him since she was a foal, born on his grandmother's small holding in Missouri, and she understood his moods better than any human ever had. When he grew frustrated with the stubbornness of the rock, she would press her muzzle against his shoulder. When he forgot to eat, she would nicker until he paid attention. And when he spoke aloud the things his grandmother had taught him, reciting her wisdom to the empty air, Copper's ears would swivel forward as if she too remembered the old woman's voice. The excavation began in June of 1883 and continued for 18 months. Caleb worked alone, driving steel chisels into the limestone face, hauling out rubble in buckets that he dumped into the ravine below his claim. The work was brutal and slow. His hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again over the calluses. His shoulders ached constantly. He lost weight he could not afford to lose, his frame growing gaunt as the hole in the hillside grew deeper. Some nights, by firelight, he calculated his expenses in the margins of his grandmother's journals. Pick handles, $2.40 for 3, replaced twice. Blasting powder, $14 for enough to break through the harder veins. Timber for framing, $123, hauled from the sawmill 12 miles distant. Limestone slabs for the interior lining, $47, quarried from his own excavation and mortared with lime he burned himself. Glass jars, $68 for 800, purchased in lots from 3 different suppliers to avoid questions. Beeswax, salt, vinegar, sugar, spices, another $82 over the course of 2 years. The total came to $470, not counting his own labor, which he valued at nothing because there was no one else who would have done the work. The chamber itself reached 40 feet deep into the hillside by the autumn of 1884. The entrance was fitted with a heavy oak door, iron-banded and set into a frame of mortared limestone, and from the outside it looked like nothing more than an unusually sturdy root cellar. Inside, the passage sloped gently downward before opening into a room 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough for a tall man to stand without stooping. Caleb had lined the walls with limestone slabs mortared tight against moisture, and he had built wooden shelving along every available surface, shelves sturdy enough to hold hundreds of glass jars, each one a promise kept to tomorrow. The temperature inside the chamber never varied. 52 degrees in winter, 52 degrees in summer, 52 degrees when the surface above baked under a 100-degree sun, and 52 degrees when snow piled 3 feet deep against the door. Caleb tested it obsessively, recording his measurements in the back of his grandmother's third journal, and every reading confirmed what she had taught him about northern exposure and limestone and the Earth's natural constancy. By August of 1886, the chamber held 800 glass jars, preserved tomatoes, pickled cabbage, dried venison packed in salt, beans stored in sealed crocks, cornmeal protected from weevils by layers of bay leaves, honey that would never spoil, vinegar that could be stretched with water. Every jar was labeled in Caleb's careful hand, and every label included the date of preservation and the method used. The shelves held enough food to sustain a dozen people for 2 years, perhaps longer if portions were carefully rationed. No one in Timber Creek knew exactly how much the chamber contained. They knew only that the newcomer on the North Hillside had spent nearly 2 years digging into rock, and they had formed their opinions accordingly. If you want more stories about resilience, preparation, and communities that have to learn the hard way, check out the video in the description below. You will find something there that stays with you. Reverend Hosea Coldwell had been the first to give voice to those opinions. The Reverend was a tall man with a voice that carried, and his church on Main Street served as the social center of Timber Creek. What Reverend Coldwell approved, the community approved. What he condemned, the community shunned. And he had made his position on Caleb Beckett clear from the newcomer's first month in town. The nickname had come from a Sunday sermon. Caleb himself had not been present. He attended no services, preferring to work through the Sabbath like any other day. But the story reached him through the blacksmith, Samuel Reeves, who relayed it with undisguised amusement while refusing to shoe copper because he was too busy with paying customers. "The Reverend called you the ditch digger," Reeves had said, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. Said, while godly men plant seeds in faith, our newcomer burrows into rock like a frightened rabbit. Got a good laugh from that one, the whole congregation did. Caleb had said nothing. He had led copper away unshod and spent that evening teaching himself farrier work by lantern light, his grandmother's voice in his memory reminding him that any skill could be learned if the need was great enough. The nickname spread. The ditch digger. Children called it after him in the street. Men used it in the saloon. Women whispered it behind their hands when he came to town for supplies. And Reverend Coldwell's sister, Martha Pritchard, ensured that the social exclusion extended into every corner of community life. Martha Pritchard ran the Ladies' Aid Society, which meant she determined who received invitations to quilting bees and barn raisings, whose children were welcomed at Sunday school picnics, and whose surplus goods found buyers among the respectable families of Timber Creek. For 3 years, Caleb Beckett had received no invitations, no customers, and no help of any kind. When Copper threw her shoe on the road outside town, no passing wagon stopped to offer assistance. When his winter supplies ran low one February, no neighbor appeared with bread or salt pork. He lived as his grandmother had once described the years after the clearances, like a ghost among the living, visible but not acknowledged. Standing in his completed chamber one evening in early August of 1886, with the lantern light playing across 800 sealed jars, Caleb spoke aloud for the first time in days. Copper stood in her paddock outside, visible through the open door, her pale coat luminous in the dusk. "Let them call me what they will, Copper," he said quietly. "The jars will speak for themselves when the time comes." The mare's ears swiveled toward his voice, and she nickered once, a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been nothing more than a horse acknowledging her name. Caleb allowed himself a small, grim smile. Then he sealed the chamber door behind him and went to check on his hillside spring, the one that still ran clear and cold while the creek below turned to mud. The spring on Caleb's hillside had never failed. It emerged from a crack in the limestone 30 feet above his chamber door, trickling down a channel he had carved into the rock face and collecting in a stone basin he had mortared together during his first summer on the claim. The water ran cold enough to numb his fingers even in August, and it carried none of the alkaline taste that had begun to taint the wells in town. Copper preferred it to any other water source, and Caleb had learned to trust the mare's instincts in such matters. Horses knew things that humans had forgotten how to sense. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the western peaks and the temperature finally began to ease from its brutal peak, Caleb knelt beside the basin and cupped water in his palms. He drank deeply, then splashed his face and neck, washing away the dust and sweat of another day. The spring's flow had diminished since May. He measured it weekly now, marking the level against a notch he had cut in the basin's rim. But it still produced enough to fill 3 buckets each morning. Enough for himself and Copper. Enough to carry them through whatever was coming. And something was coming. His grandmother's signs had made that clear since spring. The woolly caterpillars had grown winter coats in July. Not the patchy, uneven coats that meant a mild winter ahead, but thick, solid coverage from head to tail. The kind Moira Beckett had described seeing only twice in her life, once before the drought of 1848, and once before the winter that killed 3/4 of the cattle in Missouri in 1862. Caleb had collected 5 of the caterpillars and kept them in a jar on his table, examining them each morning, hoping he had misread the sign. By the end of July, he had accepted what they were telling him. The cattle had stopped grazing at midday in May, clustering instead in whatever shade they could find, their sides heaving, their tongues hanging slack. By June, several ranchers had reported finding cows dead in the fields. Struck down by heat, they should have been able to survive. The ranchers blamed weakness in the breeding lines, or disease, or simple bad luck. Caleb recognized the truth. The animals knew the heat was only beginning, and their bodies were already failing under the strain. And Copper had refused to drink from the creek since early June. The first time, Caleb had thought she was simply being contrary, the way horses sometimes were. He had led her down to the water's edge, expecting her to lower her head and drink as she always had. Instead, she had planted her hooves and refused to move closer. When he tried to coax her forward, she had backed away, snorting, her ears flat against her skull. It took him 3 days to understand what she was telling him. The creek water had begun to turn. The drought was concentrating minerals and waste that would normally wash downstream, and Copper's more sensitive palate could detect what his own tongue could not. He had tried to warn them. In the general store one afternoon in late June, while purchasing the last of the salt he needed for his preserving work, Caleb had spoken to Elias Morton, the store's proprietor. Morton was a heavy-set man with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his forehead and a habit of chewing tobacco while he made change, a practice that left brown stains on the coins he handed back. "You might want to lay in extra provisions," Caleb had said, keeping his voice neutral. "The signs point to a hard year coming." Morton had paused in his counting, looking up with an expression that mixed amusement with contempt. "Signs," he says. "The ditch digger reads signs now, does he? The caterpillars, the cattle behavior, the way the Reverend Coldwell assured everyone just last Sunday that faith will bring rain by harvest," Morton interrupted, returning to his counting. "Said the good Lord rewards those who trust in him, not those who burrow into the ground like frightened animals." He slid the coins across the counter without meeting Caleb's eyes. "That will be $3.40. Anything else?" Caleb had taken his salt and left without another word. The memory of that exchange stayed with him as he rose from the spring basin and walked back toward his chamber. The door stood open to the cooling evening air, the lamplight within casting a warm rectangle of gold across the rocky ground. Inside, the shelves stretched back into shadow, each one laden with glass jars that caught the light and threw it back in amber and ruby and the deep green of pickled vegetables. 800 jars. 800 promises kept. But the work was not finished. Caleb had learned from his grandmother that preparation was not a task to be completed, but a state of being to be maintained. Food preserved last year must be rotated before food preserved this year. Seals must be checked for weakness. Dry goods must be examined for weevils and mold. The chamber itself required constant attention. A crack in the mortar could admit moisture. A shift in the timber framing could compromise the structure's integrity. A forgotten jar could spoil and contaminate its neighbors with the stench of rot. He moved through the chamber that evening with the methodical thoroughness Moira had drilled into him, lifting each jar, turning it to the light, checking the seal for any sign of bubbling or discoloration. The tomatoes from 1884 still showed the bright red of the day they had been sealed, suspended in liquid as clear as creek water used to be. The venison from last winter had darkened to a rich brown, packed in salt so dense that no decay could reach it. The pickled cabbage retained its sharp tang, the lids still tight enough that his thumbnail could not find purchase at the edges. Tomorrow he would begin the final phase of preparation before the worst of the drought struck. He had identified a section of his hillside where wild onions grew in profusion, and he intended to harvest every bulb before the heat killed them. The root vegetables in his small garden plot, carrots, turnips, beets, would be ready for pulling within the week, and he had already cleared space on the lower shelves for 40 additional jars of pickled roots. His grandmother had always said that roots were the foundation of survival, the difference between lingering hunger and true starvation. The cost of these final preparations would be minimal. He had jars enough, purchased during the months when his expenses had seemed almost manageable. The vinegar he needed was already mixed and aging in a crock near the chamber door. Salt, sugar, beeswax, all laid in during the previous winter, when the merchants in town had still been willing to sell to him despite their personal distaste for his company. The only cost now was labor, and labor he had in abundance. He recorded his inventory in the margin of his grandmother's third journal, the one that held her most detailed instructions for long-term preservation. 823 jars currently sealed and stored. 42 pounds of dried beans in sealed crocks. 18 pounds of cornmeal, protected against weevils by bay leaves layered between each stratum of grain. 3 crocks of honey, each holding approximately 15 pounds. 2 barrels of salt, one already opened for ongoing use. 5 gallons of vinegar at full strength, with another 8 gallons diluted for immediate preservation needs. If you are interested in more stories about communities that underestimate quiet preparation, the link in the pinned comment has something you will want to see. Enough for 1 man and 1 horse for 3 years. Enough for a dozen people for 2 years, perhaps longer if carefully rationed. Enough to keep a small community alive through a disaster that none of them believed was coming. The next morning, Caleb began harvesting wild onions before dawn. He worked with a short-handled hoe, loosening the soil around each cluster of bulbs, shaking free the dirt, and laying them in neat rows on a canvas tarp he had spread at the base of the slope. The onions were small but plentiful, and by mid-morning he had filled 3 bushel baskets with their pungent harvest. His eyes watered constantly from the fumes, and his hands would carry the smell for days, but the onions would preserve well in salt brine and provide essential nutrition during the months ahead. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature with it. By noon, the air shimmered above the rocky ground, and Caleb retreated to the relative coolness of his chamber to rest and drink. He sat on an overturned crate near the entrance, where he could catch whatever breeze stirred outside, and he watched the valley below through half-closed eyes. Timber Creek lay spread out before him like a map, its buildings clustered along the muddy thread of the dying watercourse. He could see the church steeple where Reverend Coldwell delivered his weekly sermons, the general store where Morton dispensed goods and gossip in equal measure, the blacksmith shop where Samuel Reeves had turned him away 3 times now when copper needed shoeing. He could see the homes of the families who had decided, on Martha Pritchard's recommendation, that the newcomer on the North Hillside was not fit company for decent folk. From this distance, they all looked so small. A rider appeared on the road below, moving at a walk, and Caleb watched without much interest until he recognized the horse, a chestnut gelding with a white blaze, carrying a woman in a dark dress and a bonnet that shaded her face from the brutal sun. Martha Pritchard, on her way to call on one of the families in the valley, dispensing charity and judgment in the particular combination she had perfected over the years. The road passed within a quarter-mile of Caleb's claim, and for a moment he thought she might turn aside, might ride up the slope to deliver whatever new instruction the Reverend had devised for his humiliation. But she did not even glance in his direction. She rode past as if the hillside did not exist, as if he did not exist, and within minutes she had disappeared around a bend in the road. Caleb allowed himself a bitter smile. Easier to pretend he was invisible than to acknowledge that the ditch digger had built something they could not understand. The afternoon brought another visitor, this one less deliberate in his approach. Tommy Reeves, the blacksmith's son, came scrambling up the slope with a fishing pole over his shoulder and a hopeful expression on his face. He was perhaps 9 years old, with his father's broad features and his mother's nervous disposition, and he froze when he saw Caleb sitting in the chamber entrance. "I was just," the boy stammered. "The fish. They used to—" "There are no fish left in this section of the creek," Caleb said quietly. "They went downstream weeks ago, looking for deeper water." Tommy's face fell. "Pa said you were strange," he blurted out, then immediately looked horrified at his own words. "Your father is not wrong." Caleb rose from the crate and stretched, his joints popping after hours of stillness. "Tell him the beavers have built their dam 3 feet higher than usual this year. The animals know what is coming, even if the people do not." The boy backed away, clutching his fishing pole like a talisman against the strange man's stranger words. Then he turned and ran, his feet kicking up small clouds of dust with each step, and Caleb watched him go with an expression that might have been pity or might have been resignation. That evening, as the heat finally broke enough to make movement bearable, Caleb led Copper down to the road for a walk. The mare needed exercise, and he needed to see with his own eyes what the drought was doing to the land beyond his hillside. They walked for perhaps 2 miles, following the road toward town and then cutting across country where the terrain allowed, and everywhere they went, the signs of catastrophe multiplied. The pastures were brown and brittle, the grass so dry that it crumbled to powder under Copper's hooves. The trees along the creek showed dead branches extending from every trunk, and the leaves that remained had curled into tight cylinders to conserve whatever moisture they still held. The cattle they passed stood in listless groups, their ribs visible through hides stretched tight over prominent bones. Several of them did not even lift their heads as the horse and rider passed. They came eventually to the edge of the Thornton property, where a fence of split rails separated the road from what had once been a prosperous wheat field. The wheat was dead. Every stalk had withered to a brown skeleton of its former self, and the soil between the rows had cracked into a pattern that looked like the dried bed of a vanished lake. At the field's edge, a scarecrow tilted drunkenly on its post, its stuffing bursting from gaps in the fabric, its button eyes staring at nothing. Caleb reined Copper to a stop and sat looking at the ruined field for a long moment. "They will not listen," he said softly, and the mare's ears turned toward his voice. "They have convinced themselves that faith will bring rain, that their reverend speaks for a God who would not abandon his faithful. They will hold to that belief until their children are crying from hunger, and their wells are dry, and their cattle are dead in the fields." Copper shifted beneath him, and he stroked her neck with one calloused hand. "And when that time comes, girl, what will we do?" He paused, watching the heat shimmer over the dead wheat. "We will do what my grandmother would have done. We will open the door and let them in, because that is what the jars are for. Not for us alone, for everyone who needs them, even those who called us names and turned away when we needed help." The mare nickered softly, and Caleb allowed himself a moment of vulnerability that he would never have shown another human being. "I am afraid, Copper. Not of the drought. We are prepared for that. I am afraid of what they will become when the suffering truly begins. I am afraid of watching children die while their fathers curse the sky. I'm afraid that by the time they come to us for help, it will be too late for some of them." He drew a deep breath, steadying himself. "But we will be here. We will keep our door open. And we will teach them what my grandmother taught me, if any of them are willing to learn." He turned Copper back toward the hillside as the last light faded from the sky. The following Sunday, Caleb was in his garden plot, pulling carrots, when he heard the church bell ring out across the valley. The sound reached him clearly despite the distance, a bronze voice calling the faithful to worship. He paused in his work, listening, and he wondered what Reverend Coldwell would tell his congregation today. He learned the answer that evening when a group of young men from town rode past his claim, their voices carrying on the still air. "The Reverend says the drought is a test of faith," one of them called out, loud enough to ensure Caleb heard. "He says those who prepare instead of pray show their lack of trust in the Lord." "Maybe the ditch digger should dig himself a hole to hide in when the Lord sends his judgment," another added, and they all laughed. Caleb did not respond. He continued pulling carrots, his hands steady despite the anger that burned in his chest, and he told himself what he had told himself every day for 3 years. Let them talk. The jars will speak for themselves when the time comes. But Martha Pritchard was not content with mere talk. By the following week, Caleb learned that the Ladies' Aid Society had passed a formal resolution. Any family found to have dealings with the hermit on the North Hill would be excluded from society functions until they had made public repentance for their lapse in judgment. The resolution did not use his name or his nickname, but everyone in Timber Creek knew who it meant. The isolation, already near complete, became absolute. The general store would still sell to him. Morton's greed outweighed his distaste, but the other customers would leave when he entered, crowding out the door rather than share space with the ditch digger. The few passing greetings he had occasionally received on the road ceased entirely. Even the children stopped calling names after him, which might have seemed like an improvement, except that Caleb understood what it meant. They had been instructed not to acknowledge his existence at all. He became, as his grandmother had once been in the years after the clearances, a ghost among the living. But ghosts, as Moira Beckett had taught him, could survive when the living could not. Ghosts did not need the approval of their neighbors. Ghosts did not rely on the community's goodwill for their survival. Ghosts prepared quietly in the shadows, and when the disaster came, the ghosts were still standing while those who had shunned them perished. Caleb did not want to be a ghost. He did not want to watch his neighbors suffer and die while he remained comfortable in his underground chamber. But he had learned during 3 years of mockery and exclusion that he could not force people to accept help they did not want. All he could do was prepare. Prepare and wait, and keep his door ready to open when the time finally came. The carrots went into 42 jars, pickled in vinegar and dill. The turnips followed, then the beets, then the wild onions he had harvested earlier in the week. By the end of August, the shelves held 861 jars, and the temperature in the chamber remained a steady 52 degrees, while the world outside baked under a sun that showed no mercy. If you have made it this far into the story, consider subscribing for more tales of preparation and persistence. The next part gets darker before it gets better. On the last day of August, Caleb climbed to the highest point of his hillside claim and looked out over the valley. The creek had stopped flowing entirely 3 days ago, leaving only stagnant pools that bred mosquitoes and spread disease. The wells in town were showing signs of failure, their water turning brackish and foul. The cattle were dying faster now, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single day, and the ranchers had stopped bothering to drag the carcasses away. The geese, he noted, were already flying south. 2 months early. His grandmother had told him about the geese. When the geese left early, it meant the birds could sense something the humans could not. a winter so harsh that even creatures built for cold were fleeing before its approach. Combined with the caterpillars and the cattle and the beaver dams built higher than any summer should require, the message was clear. Whatever was coming would be worse than anything Timber Creek had faced before. Caleb stood on that hillside until the sun set, watching the lights flicker on in the town below, watching the smoke rise from chimneys despite the heat, watching the small movements of people who still believed that faith would save them. Then he walked back down to his chamber, sealed the door behind him, and began the long process of waiting for the disaster to arrive. September arrived not as a month but as a sentence. The thermometer outside Morton's General Store read 103 degrees on the first day, and it did not drop below 98 for the next 4 weeks. The sun, which had been merely punishing throughout the summer, became something else entirely. A weight pressing down on the valley, a physical force that seemed to push the air from lungs and the hope from hearts. The sky turned the color of brass, then copper, then a sickly yellow that made the cattle bellow in confusion and the horses press their ears flat against their skulls. Caleb watched it all from his hillside. He had not sealed himself inside the chamber as fully as he had planned. There was too much to observe, too much to document in the margins of his grandmother's journals. He rose each morning before dawn, when the temperature had dropped to a merely brutal 87 degrees, and he walked the perimeter of his claim, checking the spring, noting the behavior of the few wild creatures that remained. The rabbits had abandoned their warrens. The prairie dogs had sealed their burrows with mud that baked hard as brick. Even the rattlesnakes, those cold-blooded survivors, had retreated to whatever depths they could find. The town below him withered like a grape left too long on the vine. He could see it happening in stages, day by day, a slow-motion collapse that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not read the signs. The Thornton wheat field, already ruined when he had last observed it, turned from brown to gray to white, the stalks bleaching in the relentless sun until they looked like the bones of some vast, buried creature. The pastures that surrounded the town became dust bowls, the grass reduced to powder that rose in choking clouds whenever the wind stirred. The cattle stopped dying in ones and twos. Now they fell in groups, their bodies swelling in the heat before the ranchers could drag them away. By September 15th, the thermometer read 107 degrees. Caleb had never seen a number that high in his life. The wells failed in sequence, like dominoes falling. The Morrison well went first on September 18th, its water turning so foul that the family's dog refused to drink from the bucket. The Peterson well followed 3 days later, simply ceasing to produce anything but mud. The Coldwell well, the deepest in town, the one the Reverend had blessed personally and proclaimed would never fail, lasted until the 23rd, when Martha Pritchard's screams could be heard clear across town as she hauled up a bucket of liquid that smelled like something dead. The general store began rationing on September 20th. Morton, his face gray with fear despite the heat, posted a sign in his window. 1 purchase per family per day. No credit. The prices, Caleb noted when he made his weekly trip for salt, had tripled. A pound of flour that had cost 12 cents in July now commanded 36. Sugar, what little remained, had risen to 50 cents a pound. The canned goods that Morton had laughed about, claiming no one needed preserved food when God provided fresh, sold out within 3 days of the rationing beginning. On September 26th, Reverend Coldwell called a special prayer service. Caleb did not attend, but he heard about it from the few words the blacksmith's boy let slip when their paths crossed on the road. The Reverend had preached for 3 hours about faith conquering adversity, about the tests that God placed before his chosen people, about the rain that would surely come if only the congregation believed hard enough. He had not mentioned the ditch digger. He had not mentioned the hillside chamber. He had not mentioned the 861 jars that sat in perfect stillness while his own pantry grew bare. The congregation had said Amen. They had prayed until their knees ached on the wooden floor. They had believed with all the fervor that desperate people can muster. The next day, the temperature reached 109 degrees, and young Thomas Weaver collapsed in the Hendricks pasture. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear how Caleb responds when the town that rejected him begins to starve. The story takes an unexpected turn. The boy was 7 years old. Caleb learned this later when the news spread through the valley like the dust that now covered everything. Thomas had been bringing water to his family's remaining cattle, 4 animals out of an original herd of 30, when the heat simply overwhelmed his small body. His mother found him 3 hours later curled in the shadow of a dead cow, his lips cracked and his skin the color of bleached linen. He never regained consciousness. The doctor, such as he was, said that the boy's blood had thickened in his veins until his heart could no longer pump it. He said Thomas probably had not suffered much, that the heat had taken him quickly, that there was nothing anyone could have done. Caleb knew better. There was something anyone could have done. There was water, cool and clean, flowing from the spring on his hillside. There were jars of preserved vegetables, rich with moisture and nutrients, sitting untouched on his shelves. There was survival, readily available, if only anyone had asked. But no one had asked. The resolution that Martha Pritchard had pushed through the Ladies' Aid Society remained in effect, and the good people of Timber Creek would rather watch their children die than break bread with the ditch digger. Thomas Weaver was buried on September 28th, in a grave that had to be dug at night because the ground was too hot to work during the day. Reverend Coldwell presided over the service, his voice cracking with heat and grief, his assurances of heaven sounding hollow even to his most devoted parishioners. Caleb stood on his hillside and watched the distant cluster of mourners, a dark smudge against the yellow-white landscape, and he felt something in his chest that might have been anger, or might have been sorrow, or might have been both. His grandmother had told him about this feeling. She had described it during the long winter nights in Missouri, when the fire burned low and her eyes grew distant with memory. The clearances had brought it, the feeling of watching your neighbors suffer while you survived, the guilt that came with preparation, the terrible weight of being right when being wrong would have been so much easier. Moira Beckett had survived it. She had carried that feeling across an ocean and through decades of living, and she had taught her grandson that the only cure was action. But action required someone to act upon. Caleb could not force-feed the town. He could not drag families to his chamber and make them drink from his spring. He could only wait and watch and keep his door ready for the moment when pride finally broke. The moment came closer on October 4th, when Widow Patterson died. She was 81 years old, and she had lived in Timber Creek since before it had a name. Her husband had been one of the original settlers, a trapper who had recognized the value of the creek when it still ran deep and clear. She had buried him in 1867, and she had spent the 19 years since then tending a small garden, making quilts for newborn babies, and dispensing advice that ranged from genuinely wise to completely impractical. Everyone in town loved Widow Patterson, even Martha Pritchard, whose charity seemed carefully calculated to exclude certain people, had always made time for the old woman's company. The widow's death was not dramatic. There was no collapse in a field, no desperate search, no moment of tragedy that could be pointed to as the end. She simply ran out of medicine. The doctor had been giving her small doses of digitalis for her heart, a preparation that required fresh supplies from the pharmacist in Denver. The supply wagons had stopped running in August, when the roads became too dangerous and the horses too weak to make the journey. The doctor's reserves had lasted until late September. On October 1st, he gave Widow Patterson his final dose and told her to rest, to conserve her strength, to pray. She died in her sleep on October 4th, her hands folded across her chest, her face peaceful in a way that seemed almost like mockery. Her heart had simply given up, lacking the medicine that could have kept it beating for another year, another decade, another lifetime of quilts and advice and gentle presence. Reverend Coldwell presided over this funeral as well. His voice had grown hoarse from preaching and praying, and the congregation that gathered at the graveside was noticeably smaller than the one that had buried Thomas Weaver. Some families had already left Timber Creek, loading their remaining possessions onto wagons and heading for Denver or Colorado Springs or anywhere that was not here. Others were too weak to walk the distance to the cemetery. Still others had simply lost the will to mourn, their capacity for grief exhausted by the relentless accumulation of disaster. The church vegetable garden, which Reverend Coldwell had planted with such ceremony the previous spring, had been dead for weeks. The tomato plants had withered first, their leaves curling and browning until they looked like dried tobacco. The beans had followed, then the squash, then the corn that the Reverend had proudly proclaimed would feed the poor of the community. Now, the garden was nothing but a patch of cracked earth studded with dead stalks, a monument to faith that had not been sufficient. This might be the most intense part of the story yet. Like and subscribe to see how Caleb finally makes his move to help the people who rejected him. Morton's General Store went empty on October 15th. Caleb did not witness it directly. He had stopped making the trip into town after Thomas Weaver's death, but he heard the news from a source he had not expected. The blacksmith's son, Tommy Reeves, appeared at the edge of his claim on October 16th, his broad features gaunt with hunger and his eyes red from crying or dust or both. The boy did not approach the chamber door. He simply stood at the property line, clearly visible against the yellow sky, waiting. Caleb let him wait for 10 minutes. Then he walked out to meet him. Tommy Reeves was roughly 9 years old, with his father's broad frame and his mother's dark hair. He had been among the children who called names after Caleb on the road, before Martha Pritchard's resolution had silenced even that acknowledgement. Now he stood with his hands clasped before him, his head bowed, looking like nothing so much as a penitent approaching a confessional. "The store is empty," he said. His voice cracked on the word empty, revealing either exhaustion or emotion. "Mr. Morton said there is nothing left to sell. He said the wagons are not coming. He said we should pray." Caleb studied the boy for a long moment. The sun pressed down on both of them, relentless and terrible, but he did not invite Tommy to step into the shade of the oak that grew near the chamber entrance. Not yet. First, he needed to understand what this visit meant. "Did your father send you?" he asked. Tommy shook his head. "Pa does not know I came. He said," the boy hesitated, glancing back toward the town as if expecting to see his father watching from the road. "He said we must not beg from the ditch digger. He said Reverend Coldwell would know. He said it would shame our family. Yet here you are," Caleb said. The boy's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of defiance that reminded Caleb suddenly and painfully of his grandmother. She had worn that same expression when the neighbors mocked her preparations, when the merchants charged her double for her supplies, when the world told her that she was foolish and she knew that she was right. "My sister is 4 years old," Tommy said. "She cried all night because she was hungry. Ma gave her the last of the flour this morning, mixed with water and a little sugar we had been saving. There is nothing left for tomorrow. Pa says God will provide, but," his voice broke again, "but God has not provided yet, and my sister is so small." Caleb felt his grandmother's presence like a hand on his shoulder. He remembered her voice, steady and calm, even when the Missouri winter howled outside their cabin, even when the neighbors who had mocked her preparations came begging at her door. She had not turned them away. She had not demanded apologies or extracted promises. She had simply opened her door and shared what she had, because that was what people did when other people were starving. "Come with me," Caleb said. He led the boy to the chamber entrance, the heavy oak door that looked like nothing more than the entrance to a simple root cellar. He drew out the key that hung around his neck, a precaution against theft, though no one had ever approached the chamber until today, and he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The cool air that wafted out made Tommy gasp, a sound of pure surprise and relief that cut through the oppressive heat like a blade. The chamber stretched before them 40 feet deep into the hillside, lined with limestone slabs and timber framing. The shelves covered every wall, row upon row of glass jars glinting in the light that spilled through the doorway. Vegetables in every color, green beans and yellow squash and red tomatoes and orange carrots and purple beets. Dried meat wrapped in cheesecloth, pickled eggs floating in brine, sealed containers of grain and flour and cornmeal, crocks of honey and barrels of salt and jugs of vinegar. 861 promises kept, waiting in the darkness for the moment when they would be needed. Tommy Reeves stared at the abundance with wide eyes, his mouth slightly open, his hunger written plainly on his young face. He did not speak. He did not need to. "Tell your father," Caleb said, "that I will share what I have with anyone who asks. Tell him there is no shame in accepting help when help is needed. Tell him," he paused, remembering his grandmother's words, "tell him that every jar is a promise kept, a promise to tomorrow that I remembered it, today." The boy nodded, still staring at the shelves. Then he turned to Caleb, and there were tears cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "Mr. Beckett," he said, and Caleb realized with a start that it was the first time anyone in Timber Creek had used his actual name. "Mr. Beckett, I'm sorry for what I called you. On the road." I did not understand. Caleb looked at the boy. This child who had been cruel because children are cruel when they are taught cruelty, who had followed the lead of adults who should have known better, who was now standing in a chamber that could save his family's life and apologizing for words that seemed very small against the weight of that salvation. "Go home," he said. "Bring your family here at dawn tomorrow. I will have food ready." Tommy Reeves ran down the hillside faster than should have been possible in the heat, his thin legs pumping, his arms swinging, carrying news that would spread through Timber Creek like wildfire through dry grass. The ditch digger had food. The hermit on the North Hill had water. The man they had mocked and excluded and treated as a ghost had been preparing all along, and now he was willing to share. Caleb stood at the entrance to his chamber, watching the boy disappear toward the town below, and he felt his grandmother's hand on his shoulder once more. The waiting was over. The disaster had arrived. And now, finally, the work could begin. They came at dawn, as Caleb had promised Tommy Reeves they could. Samuel Reeves arrived first, his broad shoulders bowed in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the weight of pride being set aside. His wife walked beside him, carrying their 4-year-old daughter wrapped in a thin blanket despite the heat, and Tommy followed behind, his young face caught between shame and desperate hope. The blacksmith who had refused 3 times to shoe copper now stood at the edge of Caleb Beckett's claim, with his hat crushed between his calloused hands, saying nothing at all. Caleb did not make him speak. He simply opened the chamber door and gestured them inside. The cool air hit the Reeves family like a blessing. The little girl, her name was Sarah, Caleb would learn later, lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and blinked in confusion, as if she had forgotten what relief from the heat felt like. Her mother made a sound that was half gasp and half sob, and Samuel Reeves closed his eyes for a long moment, his jaw working silently. By mid-morning, 17 people had gathered at the hillside. By noon, the number had risen to 43. By sunset of that first day, nearly half of Timber Creek's remaining population had made the walk up the north slope to stand before the heavy oak door that they had once dismissed as the entrance to a fool's folly. Caleb organized the distribution with the same methodical precision he had applied to filling the jars in the first place. 10 jars per family per week, refilled as he taught preservation techniques to any who would learn. He set up a schedule carved into a plank of wood beside the chamber entrance, assigning each family a specific time to collect their rations so that no one would need to wait in the killing heat longer than necessary. He showed the mothers how his grandmother had taught him to stretch vinegar with water for pickling, how to pack vegetables in salt so they would last through winter, how to read the signs in animal behavior that predicted weather changes weeks in advance. The contrast between his modest preparation and the expensive failures of those who had mocked him required no commentary. Reverend Coldwell's church vegetable garden lay in ruins, its carefully blessed soil cracked and dead, while Caleb's jars glowed with abundance in the chamber's cool darkness. Martha Pritchard's fine house, with its imported furniture and silk curtains, offered no protection against hunger, while the limestone chamber she had called a waste of good rock maintained its steady 52 degrees regardless of what happened above ground. Morton's general store stood empty, its shelves bare, its proprietor reduced to the same desperation as his customers, while 861 jars waited patiently on their shelves to fulfill their purpose. Caleb did not gloat. He did not remind anyone of what they had said or done. He simply worked, from dawn until well past dark, feeding and teaching and demonstrating the skills his grandmother had given him. The deaths continued despite his efforts. Some had waited too long to seek help, their bodies too depleted to recover even with food and water. Old Mrs. Hendricks passed on October 22nd, 3 days after finally accepting Caleb's invitation to come to the chamber. Her husband had forbidden her to associate with the ditch digger until the moment he himself collapsed from exhaustion, and by then the damage was done. Caleb attended her burial, standing at the back of the small gathering, and he noticed that no one called him by his nickname anymore. In all, 11 souls died during the Great Drought of 1886. Thomas Weaver, age 7, Widow Patterson, age 81, Mrs. Hendricks, age 63, and 8 others whose names Caleb recorded in the back of his grandmother's third journal, because someone needed to remember them and because his grandmother had taught him that every life mattered, especially those that ended too soon. But 194 souls survived. They survived because a gaunt young man had spent 18 months digging into a hillside. They survived because his grandmother had crossed an ocean carrying knowledge instead of gold. They survived because when the time came to share, Caleb Beckett had opened his door without demanding apologies or extracting promises. If you have ever felt overlooked or dismissed for doing things differently, you know how powerful this moment is. Drop a comment below sharing a time when you were proven right, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the resolution. The winter that followed was harsh but survivable. Caleb's chamber held enough to see the community through until spring, though portions grew smaller as the weeks wore on. He taught constantly during those dark months, holding classes by lantern light in the chamber itself, demonstrating techniques that had saved his grandmother during the clearances and that had now saved an entire town. Some learned quickly, others struggled with the patience required for proper preservation. But all who came learned something, and Caleb turned no one away. The rains returned in March. They came slowly at first, a few drops pattering against the dust, then more. Then a steady downpour that turned the dead creek back into something that might one day support life again. The people of Timber Creek gathered at the church to give thanks, and for the first time in nearly a year, the mood was something other than desperation. They had survived. Against all reasonable expectation, they had survived. The gathering came in March, 3 days after the rains began. It was not announced from the pulpit or organized by the Ladies' Aid Society. It simply happened. The way things happen in small communities when a reckoning is overdue. People began walking toward the North Hillside in the late afternoon, alone or in small groups, their faces solemn with the weight of what they had come to do. By the time the sun touched the western mountains, nearly the entire surviving population of Timber Creek stood in a loose semicircle before Caleb Beckett's chamber door. Caleb emerged from inside where he had been conducting his daily inventory and stopped short at the sight of them. He had expected more collection appointments, perhaps a few students for the evening lesson on smoking meat. He had not expected this. Reverend Hosea Coldwell stepped forward first. The preacher looked nothing like the commanding figure who had coined the name Ditch Digger from his pulpit 3 years earlier. His fine black coat hung loose on a frame that had lost 30 pounds to hunger. His silver hair, once carefully pomaded, had gone wild and unkempt. His eyes, which had once blazed with certainty, now carried the hollow look of a man who had watched everything he believed crumble to dust. He stopped 10 feet from Caleb and stood there for a long moment, his hands hanging at his sides, his chin trembling slightly as he gathered the words he had come to speak. "I called you the Ditch Digger," he said, and his voice cracked on the nickname he had invented. "I stood in my pulpit, in the house of God, and I told my congregation that while godly men plant seeds in faith, our newcomer burrows into rock like a frightened rabbit. I made them laugh at you. I made them believe that your preparations were a sign of weak faith, of cowardice, of something shameful." He paused, swallowing hard, and when he continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. "When the drought came, I told my people to pray harder. I told them that God would provide rain if only they believed strongly enough. I watched my garden die, and I blamed their lack of faith. I watched Thomas Weaver buried in ground so hard the gravediggers broke 2 shovels, and I told his parents that God had called him home for a purpose we could not understand. I watched Widow Patterson die without her medicine, because I had assured everyone that the supply wagons would come, that faith would bring them through, that we did not need the preparations of a man who dug ditches instead of trusting in providence." His voice broke completely, and tears began streaming down his weathered face. "Your jars fed my congregation when my prayers could not. Your water kept their children alive when the wells I blessed went dry. Your teaching gave them skills that will protect them for the rest of their lives, while my sermons gave them nothing but false hope. I was wrong. I was proud, and I was wrong, and I ask your forgiveness." The Reverend lowered himself to one knee in the dirt before Caleb Beckett, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Before Caleb could respond, Martha Pritchard stepped forward. She had lost her chestnut gelding with the white blaze 3 weeks into the drought, when there was no longer enough water to keep him alive. She had lost her position as head of the Ladies' Aid Society when the society itself dissolved in the face of survival. She had lost the social power that had allowed her to organize the exclusion of anyone who associated with the newcomer on the North Hill. Now she stood before the man she had worked so hard to isolate, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I pushed through a resolution," she said, her voice high and thin with shame. "I told the Ladies' Aid Society that anyone who dealt with you would be excluded from all community functions. I organized your ostracism. I made sure you received no invitations, no customers, no human kindness of any kind. I told myself I was protecting our community from an outsider who did not belong. When the drought came, my resolution meant nothing. When my pantry stood empty and my garden died, and my horse," her voice caught, "when my horse died because I had no water to give him, your chamber door was the only place that offered help. You fed me. You gave me water. You taught me how to preserve what little we have left so that I will never be so helpless again. And you did it without a word of reproach, without demanding that I apologize for what I had done. I apologize now. I ask your forgiveness. She did not kneel, but she bowed her head deeply, her shoulders hunched with the weight of her confession. Samuel Reeves came forward next, the blacksmith whose refusal to shoe copper had forced Caleb to learn farrier work by lantern light. "I turned you away 3 times, he said, his deep voice rough with emotion. 3 times you came to my forge with your mare, and 3 times I told you I was too busy with paying customers. I laughed about it afterward with the other men. I called you the ditch digger behind your back and felt clever for it." He looked down at his calloused hands that had shaped iron for 20 years, but had been unable to shape the drought into something survivable. "When my daughter was crying from hunger, when my wife was rationing the last of our flour, when I had nothing left to give them, you opened your door. You did not ask me to apologize for what I had said. You did not remind me that I had refused to help you when you needed help. You simply fed my family and taught my son how to preserve food so that he will never watch his own children go hungry." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I was wrong about you. I ask your forgiveness." Elias Morton, the general store proprietor, stepped forward. He had lost weight too, his once heavy-set frame now merely soft, his sweating face now gaunt and pale. "I laughed when you warned me to stock extra provisions," he said. "I told you that Reverend Coldwell had assured us faith would bring rain by harvest. I charged you higher prices than I charged anyone else in town because I knew you had no other options. I took your money and I mocked you for how you spent it." He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "My store went empty because I did not listen. My shelves went bare because I trusted reassurance over evidence. And when there was nothing left to sell, when my customers were starving and I had nothing to give them, your jars filled the gap that my foolishness had created. You saved my customers. You saved my reputation. You saved me." He met Caleb's eyes directly. "I ask your forgiveness." The semicircle of townspeople stood silent after the confessions ended. Some wept quietly. Others simply stood with bowed heads, sharing in the weight of what their leaders had acknowledged. They had all played their part in the exclusion, the mockery, the deliberate cruelty disguised as social order. They had all called him the ditch digger, if not aloud, then in their hearts. And they had all been saved by the preparations they had mocked. Caleb Beckett looked at the people gathered before him, the reverend kneeling in the dirt, the society matron with her head bowed, the blacksmith who could not meet his eyes, the merchant who had overcharged him for 3 years, and he felt his grandmother's presence so strongly that he almost turned to look for her. "My grandmother used to say," he began, and the words came slowly, measured and deliberate, shaped by 3 years of silence and a lifetime of her teaching, that every jar is a promise kept, a promise to tomorrow that you remembered it today. She said it when the neighbors mocked her preparations. She said it when the merchants charged her double. She said it when the world called her foolish and paranoid and strange. He paused, looking out at the faces of those who had treated him exactly as his grandmother had been treated, and who had learned exactly what she had known all along. She survived the clearances because she prepared while others trusted that nothing bad would happen. She crossed an ocean because she knew that survival required action, not just faith. She raised me to watch for signs, to learn from animals, to seal jars against the future because the future does not care whether you believe in it or not. His voice grew stronger, not with anger, but with conviction. "You ask my forgiveness. I cannot give you what you are asking because what you did to me required no forgiveness. You were afraid of what you did not understand. You were made uncomfortable by someone who prepared for disaster while you preferred to believe disaster would not come. That is not a sin that requires absolution. That is simply human nature." He looked at each of them in turn, the Reverend still kneeling, the others standing with their confession spoken and their eyes uncertain. What I can give you is what my grandmother gave to those who mocked her and then came begging at her door. She did not forgive them, because she did not believe there was anything to forgive. She simply opened her door and shared what she had, because that is what people do when other people are suffering. And then she taught them, so that they would never need to beg again. He stepped forward, reaching down to help Reverend Coldwell rise from his knees. The preacher's hand trembled in his grip, and Caleb steadied him as he would have steadied copper on uncertain ground. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn, tomorrow and every day after, until you all know what my grandmother knew and what she taught me. That is what she would have done. That is what I choose to do. The Reverend stood unsteadily, his face wet with tears, and he looked at Caleb Beckett as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered. Caleb shook his head. "Do not thank me. Learn, and then teach others. That is thanks enough. The story is not just about one man and one drought. If you want to see more stories about preparation, vindication, and the power of inherited wisdom, check out the playlist linked below. You will find more tales of those who were mocked and proven right. The lessons began the following morning and continued for 40 years. Caleb Beckett taught every family in Timber Creek how to excavate a hillside chamber, how to select limestone for its temperature-regulating properties, how to seal jars against time and spoilage, how to read the signs that animals provided before any disaster struck. He taught with patience and precision, the same way his grandmother had taught him, and he never turned away a student regardless of what they had said or done during the years of his ostracism. Reverend Hosea Coldwell became his most devoted student. The preacher who had coined the name Ditch Digger spent the remaining 15 years of his life advocating for practical preparation, alongside spiritual faith. He revised his sermons to include teachings about stewardship and foresight. He told his congregation that God helped those who helped themselves, and that a sealed jar was as much a form of prayer as any words spoken in church. When he died in 1901, his final request was to be buried beside the chamber he had helped dig with his own hands, a chamber modeled exactly on Caleb Beckett's original design. The term ditch digger transformed in the decades that followed. What had once been an insult became something else entirely. When a young man showed unusual foresight in his preparations, the old-timers would nod approvingly and say he is a real ditch digger. When a family invested in preservation equipment instead of luxuries, their neighbors would comment that they were building their future the ditch digger way. The mockery had become reverence, the sneer had become respect, and the name that had been meant to shame Caleb Beckett became his greatest legacy. By 1926, 217 hillside chambers dotted the Colorado Territory, all called Beckett Cellars by the families who maintained them. Each one was built according to the specifications Caleb had taught: 40 feet deep, northern exposure, limestone lining, steady temperature regardless of season. Each one held hundreds of jars, promises kept to tomorrows that might bring drought or flood, or any of the disasters that nature held in store, and each one bore a small carved marker near its entrance, an inscription that Caleb had insisted upon for every chamber he helped design. Copper died in the spring of 1904, at the remarkable age of 24. She had been with Caleb since she was a foal, born on his grandmother's Missouri holding, and she had listened to more of his thoughts than any human ever would. He buried her beside the original chamber, wrapped in the same Scottish quilt that held his grandmother's remains back in Missouri, and he carved her name into a limestone slab that he set above her grave. For the remaining 30 years of his life, he visited that grave every evening, standing in silence as the sun set over the mountains, speaking to her sometimes in the quiet way he had always spoken to her. Caleb Beckett died in 1934, at the age of 72, He passed in his chair beside the chamber door, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, his hands resting on a jar of tomatoes he had sealed that afternoon. The jar was the last of the season, and his fingers curled around it in the same position his grandmother's fingers had curled around his hands so many years before. They buried him beside Copper, as he had requested. The entire population of Timber Creek attended, along with representatives from the 217 families who maintained Beckett cellars across the territory. 3 generations of students spoke at his funeral, sharing stories of what he had taught them and how his teachings had saved their families from one disaster or another. The reverend who conducted the service, a young man who had never met Hosea Coldwell but who had grown up hearing stories about the original ditch digger, spoke of legacy and wisdom passed down through generations. The chamber still stands. It stands on the north hillside above Timber Creek, its heavy oak door replaced twice over the century, but its limestone structure as sound as the day Caleb finished mortaring the final slab. Visitors come from across the country to see it, to stand in its 52-degree coolness, to run their hands along shelves that once held 800 promises kept to tomorrows. The Colorado Historical Society maintains it now, and docents tell the story of the young man who arrived with his grandmother's journals and his Palomino mare, and who saved an entire town by doing what everyone else had called foolish. Above the door, carved into a limestone slab that has weathered 100 winters and 100 summers, the inscription reads in letters still sharp and clear after all these years. Every jar is a promise kept. Moira Beckett would have recognized those words. She would have recognized the chamber they adorned, built according to principles she had learned during the darkest days of the clearances. She would have recognized the 217 other chambers scattered across the territory, each one a promise kept to the future by people who had learned from her grandson. And she would have been proud, not of the fame or the legacy or the transformation of mockery into respect, but simply of the jars themselves, sealed and waiting, ready to fulfill their purpose when the time came. Her words had crossed an ocean and a century. They had survived clearances and drought, mockery and redemption, death and the long passage of years. And they endure still, carved in stone above a chamber door on a Colorado hillside, promising tomorrow that someone remembered it today.